Well, here we are back in our good old color example again. Having just talked about sessions in the previous video, you're probably expecting that we'll use sessions here in this example, which is, of course, exactly what I intend. Maybe where I want to use sessions, however, might not be exactly where you're expecting. Previously, when we came in and worked on our colors example, we added this thing called dark mode, and we used a cookie to be able to keep track from page to page whether dark mode was set. So setting dark mode on one page meant dark mode could still be seen as being set on another page. Turned off on one page, it would be recognized that it's turned off even when we go back to the original page. And that is potentially someplace that we could use sessions instead of cookies, but to be honest, I think cookies are actually the right tool for the job in that particular case. The reason I like cookies in that particular case rather than sessions is that I was able to, with that cookie, set it so that it wouldn't expire, if I recall correctly, for about a year. That meant that if somebody preferred dark mode, they turned dark mode on, whether they open their browser, close their browser 1,000 times, for the next year, so long as they don't wipe out their cookies, they'll always come back to dark mode again if that's what they prefer. No, what I wanted to do with sessions here in this video is something a little bit different. Essentially, at this point, there's a bit of a problem, usability type problem that we have with our colors example that I've more or less been ignoring up to this point. We've brushed up against it a few times, but I've been trying to just sort of steer clear of it until we got to this subject, until we got to the point where we could use sessions. What this problem basically is that we are doing actually at this point a very poor job of notifying the user about what our application is actually doing. For example, if I come down to one of my colors and I go to delete it, all that happens is we immediately find ourselves right back on the index page again. Now to us, being very intimately familiar with how this application works, we understand that we were redirected to the destroy page. The destroy page then actually wiped out the color. After that, it then redirected us back to the index page. So showing up back at the index page to us means, yes, that was a success. Everything worked. But to anybody but us, they might wonder, well, hey, what just happened? If they had a lot of colors here, scrolling through the colors and trying to find the one they just deleted would be a time-consuming way for them to be able to confirm that their action had actually been carried out without there being any problems. What would have been a much friendlier way to be able to handle that is if the user had clicked on the delete button and then instead of just anonymously showing back up at the index page again, if there had maybe been some sort of message that appeared on the page letting them know, hey, yes, your color was destroyed the way that you asked it to be. There's a lot of those kinds of situations that we actually have here in our application. Another example of that is when I go over to the show page. Normally when I go to the show page, everything is good and fine, but you remember that we spent some time dealing with the situation of what would happen if we go to the show page and there's no ID. What we're doing right now is just bouncing the user back to the index page with no actual indication, no error message that anything went wrong. If again we go to the show page and instead of no ID, maybe what we have is an invalid ID, 3,900,000 and whatever, there is no color with that ID, and again we just set the user back at the index page without actually telling them that anything was wrong. Most of the different places where we're actually carrying out that behavior are simply redirections that we're doing. Places where we're detecting that there was some type of error, like the fact that we have no color on the show page, we're then just redirecting the user back over to the index page. What I want to be able to do is when I do those redirections, I want to be able to then notify the user, give them some kind of message that they can see on the page that they are then sent to, so that they will understand why they just got redirected to that page that they maybe weren't expecting to end up at. There's different ways that we could potentially do that. For example, over on our edit page, we had talked about this at one point. We had actually set our edit page up so that if we did not find a color, I think initially it was set up so that if there was no ID available, what we did was we redirected to the index page, but we also passed along a URL parameter of error equals 2. The eventual idea was that on the index page, what we would do is we would set up a little if statement that said if there's an error parameter and if that error parameter's value is 2, then output a message, echo a message to the user saying no color was found. We had done something very similar to that over on the destroy page. The destroy page, if we were not able to find a color or if that color could not be destroyed, then we were passing the user back over to the index page and sending them the error value of 999. Again, the idea being that the user would get to the index page would run an if statement that would recognize that there is an error and that the error's value is 999, and then would output some message saying the color couldn't be found or the color couldn't be destroyed or something like that. You can imagine that if we went through with that plan, where every time we redirected the user anywhere, a lot of times we're redirecting to the index page, but in some cases we're redirecting the user over to the show page. In the case of a color that's just been edited or a new color that's just been added, in all of those situations, if every single one of them had its own unique error number, like the error 2 that I have up here, that would turn into quite a nasty looking if statement that I would have to put together. And that nasty looking if statement that would recognize, interpret, and display as a result of those different error codes in the URL, that's something that would then have to be dropped into almost every page on my site. So no matter where I redirected somebody to, they would be able to see the error messages that may have accumulated or may be available whenever they got to that page. So overall, that would not be a very pleasant experience in my estimation. I don't want to have to put together that big gnarly if statement to recognize all those different conditions, and I definitely don't want to then have to take that if statement and plaster it in at the top of every single one of my pages. So as another idea, what if we were to use sessions to be able to display these little short-term messages for the user? Essentially what the idea would become is that every time we have a notification, let's say, that we want to show to the user, we would set the notification in the session. We would then redirect the user to whatever page it is we want to redirect them to. So for example, here on the show page, if we're not able to find the color we're looking for, we could put a message into the session saying the color could not be found. We could then redirect them over to the index page. On the index page, we could then just say, if there's a message in the session, show it. I think that would end up being an effective way for us to be able to show these notifications to the user, and I think it would be a lot easier than if we tried to do it using URL parameters. So let's see about giving it a shot. Here on the show page might be a decent place for us to begin. Here on the show page, I already have a redirection in place for when there isn't a color to be retrieved, which could happen if the ID is invalid or if no ID is given at all. But here in this situation, I would simply want to be able to tell the user that the color they requested could not be found. Once I had redirected them to the index page, I would want that message to actually show up at the top of their page. So how should we set this up? Well, every page that is going to set or show one of these messages, which by the way I usually call them flash messages, every one of the pages that's going to deal with them is going to have session start called on it. So I might go through and call session start at the beginning of all of what I'm calling my controllers. Basically all of the pages that aren't themselves directly an HTML content type page. The ones that really do the work for the most part. So at the top of my index page, at the top of my show page, at the top of my new, edit, and the destroy page, I'll make sure the very first thing that happens on all those pages is that I call session start. Once that's done, at that point, anytime I actually want to set a message, what I could do is I could take it and I could just put it into the session. So I could say into the session, into a parameter called, let's say, flash. I'll put in a message that says the color could not be found. So I'll do that immediately before redirecting them over to the index page. And then when I actually do redirect them to the index page, it would just be a matter of checking to see if there's a message there. If there is, I display it, and then I'm actually going to erase it. Because once it's been shown once, the user has gotten the message and it does not need to be displayed again after that. So let me go ahead and go to my template page, the template that every one of my pages is based on, and instead of me having to put in the code to display those messages at the top of every page, I'll just put it one time here inside my template. So in the content, in the body of my template page, we could do something like, say, if is set session flash. So I'm checking to see if there is an element called flash in the session. And if there is, then I might want to output it as, let's say, a div. So let me put in some echoes to create a set of div tags. I've already set up some CSS to go along with this. My CSS class that I'm going to use is called Flash. And then inside that div, I will simply take and I will display whatever is in the Flash key of the session. And then once that's all done, I'm going to unset, which is how we can erase something from the session. I will unset the flash message that I stored there. So whenever the user pulls up a page, we're going to check and see if there is a flash message. If there is, it gets output along with a little bit of HTML to format it correctly. Then we unset it, so it's basically never shown again. So over on my show page, I'm set it up so that whenever we have a no ID or an invalid ID, a message should be sent. We should then be sent back to the index page, so we can use that as a test case to see if this works. If I jump back over to my browser, I'll go over to the show page for one of my colors, and if I then come up and I erase the ID number and hit enter, there we are. It redirected me back to the index page just like it has a million times before, but now when I get to the index page, a message appears. It says the color could not be found. If I go over to the show page again, the message doesn't show up. If I come back to the index page, the message is gone. So that message disappeared once it had been shown one time, which is a lot of times the reason why they are referred to as flash messages. A few things that I would like to add to this that I think might make it a little bit better. One is that instead of just having my messages always show up in gray, the way I just had them there, I might like to be able to color code the messages based on whether they are positive or negative, essentially. Whether I'm telling this user something good has happened, something has succeeded, or whether I'm telling them that something has gone wrong. The terms I'd use for that is something's gone wrong, I would call that an alert, whereas a message about something that's gone right, I would call that a notice. In order to do that, what I could do is I could say, in this particular case, flash alert, possibly. And then back over on my template page where I'm actually interpreting it, I could check for flash alert or flash notice. That would, of course, make it a little bit more complicated, but then I could take and put the actual value here into the div itself so my CSS could handle styling it different. That's one thing I would like to handle. Another thing that I would like to handle is that I think I might make it all a little bit easier if I were to actually take and put this into some sort of function, a function that could be called in order to set my flash message. So if I ever change the way that I want to label these messages, I would be able to do it more easily all in one place. So I'm thinking what I might do is, in order to keep the function along with any other functions that may eventually be created to go along with it as well, in order to keep them all sort of contained and together, I think I might create a new class in order for them all to be a part of. So here what I've done is I've created a new file called flash.php. I put it into my library folder, the same place that I have my colors file. And here in this new file, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create class flash, and I'm thinking I might create some functions in it to make it easier for me to be able to set flash. So maybe I could make a function called something like set alert, might be one. When I actually call that, I would probably need to call it from the flash class, so it would show up in the code something like flash set alert, and I could make another one like that for setting the notice. So in order to actually do that here in the flash class, let me start by making a public static function. I'm going to call this new function set alert, and I might also want another one like that for setting a notice. Now with both of those, I'm going to need to be able to pass them a message, the actual message that I want put into the flash, put into the session, essentially. And I could then take and store that value in the actual session itself. So into the session, into flash alert, I could store the message. I could then do the same thing down here in flash notice, except I'll change the name of the key. That's a possibility. Boy, those two sure are a lot alike. I'm also, the more that I think about it, getting less and less fond of the idea of having flash alert and flash notice because of the way that I would have to check for both of the two separate types of flashes in the session when it comes time to display it. So maybe instead, what if I just put flash as the element, and what if I stored the message and the type of message it is both in an array? I could say create a new array where there is a message key, and that's where I'll store the message itself. And maybe I'll then also have a type key where I'll store what type of message it is. If I do something a little bit more like that, then all I'll have to do is check generally for a flash element in the array. When it comes time to actually display it, I think it might make it a little bit easier to deal with. This also here gives us a chance to be able to use one of the benefits of sessions. With cookies, all we can store are strings, but here, since the session itself is always stored on the server, it's not actually itself written to the cookie, we can store things like arrays in them if we happen to want to. So we could take advantage of that here. Those two functions are still very, very similar, aren't they? Maybe what I could do is I could create a third function that would handle what both of them are doing. Maybe I'll create a private static function. I'll just call this one generically setFlash. And what I'll do is maybe I'll take that line where I'm actually setting the session value, and maybe I'll have this function receive the message and the type, and it'll just put them both in there, something like that. Then for my setAlert and setNotice functions, what I could do is I could just call my private function called setFlash. I could have it relay on the message it was passed along with the type that I want set for it. So there for setAlert, we could pass it the message and alert. For setNotice, we could pass it the message and the notice. Both of them will feed through setFlash, which will actually create the array and store it in the session. So I'll have the convenience of using these nice two little functions, and those two then rely on this one. So if we ever wanted to change the way things were stored, it would really be this only this one place where it had to be changed. I think that might work pretty well. Let's give it a try. If I go back over to my show page here, instead of putting the flash into the session itself, what if I change this to flash setNotice? I'm sorry, this is an alert, so let's do setAlert, and then I'll pass my message to it. That should accomplish essentially the same thing I had in there a minute ago. One thing I need to add though is that I need my flash file now, so let me go ahead and do a require for that flash class, just like I had previously for my color class. If I jump back over to my template now, in my template, we can still just check to see if there's a flash message in the session. We can still just erase that flash message at the end when we're done. And in between, we still have just our echoes to display everything, except here, when it comes time to actually display the message, what we have is basically an array inside our array. So the main array's name is flash, but the inner value that I then want from it is the key called message. And then up here in the actual div itself, what I could do is I could right at this point work in what type of message it is so that I could have different CSS styling for my different types of messages. So in my session, in the flash element, in the element called type, two-dimensional array, type being the second dimension, we could give that a try and see how that works. Let's go take a look. Back in the browser here, if I again go over to my, not my index page, my show page, I'm going to go up and I'm going to wipe out the ID number, which will result in us being sent back to the index page. And now when I am sent back to the index page, you can see my flash message is showing up in red because I set it as an alert instead of as a just generic flash message, basically different CSS is kicking in there. If I actually pull up the code that was generated, if we scroll down and find, there it is right there, you can see that my div is not just class flash now, it also has the type of alert in there as well. So now I can color code my different messages that I'm showing to the user. If I refresh this page, just like before, it disappears. It just shows up for that one time. Another reason sessions are so good for doing this sort of thing. So that seems to be working pretty well. Happy with the way that my show page is looking. I have my little flash class at this point, which should make it easy for me to be able to set these messages if I happen to want. Let's go through and put them in for a few other places. Over on my new page, I am going to need to include my flash class. So let me go ahead and put in my require for that. Then on my new page, whenever a new color is saved successfully, we redirect the user over to the show page. It might be nice for them to also have a little message to go along with that. So let me say flash set notice, and I'll pass along a message saying the new color was created. Let's go see how that one works. If I go to my new page, create a new color, I'll call it off-white, and I'll set the color to FFFFFF. When I create it, we get sent over to the show page, and on the show page, a notice message, which I've color-coded as blue, shows up here at the top that says the new color was created. If I go back to the index page, there's no more sign of that message. It disappears just like all the others. That seems to take care of the new page fairly well. How about over on the edit page? On the edit page, I'm again going to need access to my flash class, so I'll put in a require for that. Looks like we have a couple different places where I'm redirecting here. One of them is if we get to the edit page and we're not able to correctly find the color that's supposed to be edited. In that case, I could set an alert. For the alert, I'll say the color could not be found, just like we did on the show page. When the color actually is found and is updated successfully, what I could do there is I'll set a notice. The color was updated, is what I'll have it say. And then finally over on my destroy page. On the destroy page, either the color is destroyed successfully or it is not. If it is destroyed successfully, let's do flash set notice and say the color was destroyed. And if we're not able to destroy the color, we can say flash set alert, the color could not be destroyed. And oops, almost forgot to require my flash class. But there we are. Hopefully that's covered most all the situations where a little feedback to the user would be beneficial to them. Let's jump over to the browser again and see how it all works. Index page, everything's fine. Show page, everything looks normal. Dark mode still turns on and off. Everything's just as it should be. If I go and destroy a color now, I'll destroy off-white. We come right back to the index page and we get a flash message that says the color was destroyed. If I go to create a new color, I'll create a color called test, give it some values, tells me the new color was created. If I edit this color, I'll change its name to blah. It tells me the color was updated. I think that's most all of the non-error situations that we ran into, but you can see that now the application is doing a much better job of actually communicating to the user what's going on, making the user a little bit more, hopefully making the user feel a little bit more sure about exactly what's happening as they're interacting with our application. As far as other improvements we could potentially make, taking our Flash functions and making them part of a Flash class is great. It makes those functions much easier to reuse again in other projects in the future. It would also be a pretty good idea if we took this code that actually displayed the Flash messages and turned that into a function as well. Matter of fact, super easy to do, so why don't we just do it? I'm just going to take that code, that if statement, and I'm going to move it over to the Flash class itself. Over in the actual Flash class, I'll create a public static function. I'll call it showFlash, and I'll just paste in that code that I had over on my template page before. On the template page in its place then, what I will do is I will call from my Flash library showFlash, which is a lot cleaner and easier to look at. Just to test it out, doesn't look like it's working too well at all. Here on the index page, it's trying to use my Flash class, but I never actually added that Flash library to my index page, and I don't have it in my copy and paste buffer anymore. So let me retype it here. A little bit of copy and paste help. There we are. On my index page, there we go. It's back now. And again, here, let's try something different. If I go over to the edit page, let's say, and on the edit page, if I provide it with an invalid ID, there we are. So it looks like it's still displaying my messages just like it should. And I like now that I have both the setting and the showing of those Flash messages all encapsulated here in a class, a single file. So if I pull that into any project in the future, I will pretty much immediately gain the ability to be able to set and show Flash messages. So I like that a lot. One other thing that I might keep in mind in the future is notice that most every time that I'm setting a Flash message, it's then immediately followed by doing some type of redirection. In that particular case, I wonder if maybe I should write a function that both sets a Flash message and does the redirection, since those two so often, as a matter of fact, virtually every time we use them, since those two always seem to go together here, I wonder if maybe we should make a single function that takes care of both of those. Maybe we could call it redirect to or something along those lines. We could pass it where to redirect the user, the message to show them when they get there, and potentially a third optional type where we specify whether it's an alert or a notice, for example. But maybe I'll put that in off camera, or maybe I'll just leave that in there for you, leave that as a project for you to work on. But one way or another, I think those Flash messages are nice. They give us a good way to be able to keep the user informed of what's going on with the application, and they are fairly easily implemented given PHP's ability to let us work with sessions.